Right, so welcome for the final session. Thanks for hanging in there. We have heard, obviously, a great deal about the progress in the field of gene and cell therapy today, and mainly from a company perspective. And I think what we're going to do now in this session is we're going to switch to an investor perspective with the investor panel here. We'll go through some quick introductions, kick it off with a couple of questions, and then have take some questions from the audience as well at the end. We understand we're standing between you and the reception or your travel plans, so always an uncomfortable position to be in, but we're going to make sure that we're going to be ending at 5. So maybe just would like yourself to introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about your interest in the sector and where you made investments and perhaps why. So maybe starting with you, Chris.
Sure. So Chris Solomon, a partner at Syncona Partners. We are an evergreen fund which was founded by the Wellcome Trust about 3 years ago now. We've made a number of investments in what I'd consider advanced therapies. Really not because we were seduced by the biology, but because we saw dramatic clinical data, and that's what I think has really attracted us to the sector and across a range of disorders and obviously a range of modalities within the advanced therapy arena. So we've now probably started 1, 2, 3 companies specifically with advanced therapeutics, and they are going after indications that are very proximal to where we think there are good proof of concepts out there for clinical efficacy.
Great, thanks. John?
Okay, so I'm John Shields. I'm a scientist by training, immunologist originally, worked in academia, then in big pharma, in Glaxo as it then was, small biotech, Cantab Pharmaceuticals in Cambridge, and for the past 15 years have been in venture capital and life sciences. Most of that time I've been working exclusively with Abingworth LLP, who are a healthcare and life sciences focused investment firm. And I guess my interest in this area really started in the mid-90s when as Senior VP of Research at Cantab, we were developing a disabled herpes virus as a vaccine and realized that it actually also had potential as a gene therapy vector. And so I did some initial clinical trials using it to deliver cytokines to tumor patients. The field has changed quite a bit in the 20 years since we started that work, and I'm glad to say that I have finally, after many years of discussion within Abingworth, managed to convince my fellow partners and investors at Abingworth that actually now is the right time to be getting back into this area. And I do have to point out actually that before I joined Abingworth, they did have an investment in the gene therapy area, GTI. I think at that time they were probably one of, if not the only investor to actually make a profit out of gene therapy back in the 90s.
Excellent, thank you.
And I'm Gilbert Gerber. I must be here on this panel the one non-scientist and maybe one of the few in the whole forum. I've been busy working in finance for the last 25 years and only trying to catch up with science and biotech in the last 8 years now. So I have a completely, let's say, unbiased look at it. I look at the subject of today as look at any other one. And I must say I've been investing after looking at it quite closely for a long time on a very limited basis so far. But maybe I should say, because if it might transpire afterwards in the conversation, so I've been invested in the previous presentation, Ph.D, which are very convincing. And something we haven't mentioned at all today, which is a DC vaccine allogeneic company, which is a Swedish company called Immunicum, so I won't mention them anymore. I'm very interested in this area and doing a lot of work, and very interested of the risk. But I think we'll come back to the risks later on.
Great. Excellent. So we've heard a lot today about the maturation of the field, and the progress that has been made. We've seen it, on the data side. We've seen it on the business model side, on the way how we think about manufacturing for gene and cell therapy. What's been your view over the past 3 to 5 years? I mean, have you seen a change in the business plans for this particular sector? Have you seen that maturation there? Have you seen a better understanding in the investor community about gene and cell therapy? Give me a sense of whether you've seen that on that side as well, not just on the company side.
So from our perspective, we do start-up companies, so we don't tend to have people come to us with business plans. So really it's us that writes the business plan. I think we've got a lot better at it because we now understand it better than we did when we were the first one. I think there's definitely a maturation. People have inevitably understood more about this sector as they've looked at more companies and done more diligence. I think one of the things to highlight is, and it's been mentioned today, is that manufacturing's come to the fore. If you write a business plan for a cell or gene therapy, it's about the first one I've seen in my career where the CMC costs more than the clinical. And that's telling. And I think there's huge challenges in manufacturing that colleagues in the room are looking at and are working to solve. And I think they are solvable, but shouldn't be underestimated. And I think a lot of people, certainly at the beginning when I started looking at these, didn't realize that would be the gate on clinical development. But it's very much the gate. And some products will not get there. They will not get there because of CMC. And I think there's a much greater appreciation of that. The rest, I think, in that 3-year period, there's not been huge amounts of additional clinical data. We've had some extra clinical data, and that's informed us somewhat. But for that aspect to mature, for people to really understand the performance of these vectors that people are using, the cells that people are using, we need clinical data to read on, because you can do as much as you want in an animal model. We don't know if that's predictive until an animal model is correlated to a human response. So I think that bit's coming. So I haven't really seen that bit mature in the last 3 to 5 years.
What about you, John?
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly that it's a bit of a learning process for all of us. It is a different model, and I think that actually, certainly from Abingworth's point of view, that there are multiple models within this area of advanced therapy, and we're still trying to learn which ones may or may not work. So it really is a bit of an experiment in progress at the moment. But having said that, and having seen through the experience of others, like Syncona, but also our own first forays again into this field, this is something that we're probably going to have to be very flexible about, and going to have to be prepared to change and move along the way as we learn more.
Great. Gilbert?
A lot of what have been said, work in progress, I think would still be the best summary. When we are still discussing about, gene therapy, what is the best vector and how homogeneous is the one vector, I was absolutely shocked by the one comment done this afternoon. That's quite a big question to ask. But of course, the thing we haven't mentioned is the commercialization of Gilbert by Unicure, which has changed a lot. And having been an investor in the previous incarnation of Unicure, which was AMT, which I don't think if many remember that one, but it's been quite a journey. And trying to understand how this special committee works, how the regulator works, how even it interacts with politics, I may say, in this particular instance, has been, for me, quite an interesting journey. So, enthusiastic, yes. A lot of innovation, yes. Unmet medical need, all my boxes, but still work in progress.
All right, so it seems like all the stakeholders are learning together. We heard it from the regulators to the companies to the investors then. So now pivoting to risk, obviously, if you look at cell therapy, gene therapy as a sector to invest versus other biotech areas, how do you how do you think about risk, and which risk are you scrutinizing most? I mean, is it technical, regulatory? Is it commercial? Is it reimbursement? What keeps you up at night if before investing in a cell or gene therapy company, and why do it if you could go to invest in a let's say in an antibody company or a vaccine company where we have more defined models? Maybe start with you, Gilbert, since you take this kind of unbiased view.
I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to this manufacturing thing again, because once you have a small molecule, it's a little chemical entity. I mean, you know what you've got. In this particular instance, how many cases did we have where they had to stop a trial for whatever reason? Purity, something they cannot explain. I think this particular sector is really prone to be, let's say, have hiccups because of all these things. That's my main concern.
So what keeps you interested in it? So is it high valuation, or what? Why still looking at it and investing?
It's not the high valuation. The high valuation are the CAR T cell guys. Sorry, I was excluding the CAR T cell thing, which I consider more like nice to have, but maybe not what everybody thinks to be true. I mean, if I relate now again to the cell therapy, which just presented before that, and Chiadis, especially Chiadis. I mean, what if the potential market for bone marrow transplantation just expanded that much? What is left for some of the really high-profile type of... so I'm more interested in this marginal, incremental things, like how to improve bone marrow transplantation rather than having armed, B-specific CAR T-cell, blah, 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 blah.
Okay. How about you, John? How do you think about it?
So I think in this case, I would lump both the commercialization and the reimbursement together, and I would say that causes more anxiety than it would in a more conventional company. I think the very nature of the thing that we're dealing with here, where we're talking about, in some cases, cure rather than just treatment of a disease, and cure that can be administered by one or maybe a very small number of treatments, it does pose challenges, in particular because, by and large, we're talking about relatively rare diseases, and so small markets, numbers-wise. And in order to justify the investment, one then has to have a premium price paid. And so how do you structure that, and how do you get buy-in, reimbursement from the authorities, the payers, to actually get your payback on that? I would say that the technical risk is always there, but generally speaking, the opportunities we've looked at, that's not really been a serious problem, but rather I've been amazed at the creative ways that people come up with actually how trying to solve problems and how they do it.
Great. Chris?
So, all of the above. So, manufacturing is a nightmare. Commercial, no one knows the model. And you're going into the unknown. But you've got to balance that around what you're getting. I mean, the data that you've seen today is not just incremental improvement, what's gone before. It is absolutely dramatic. Absolutely dramatic. Patients that would have died alive, people that would have gone blind can see. I mean, we haven't seen that in another modality, really, to date. So there's that tantalizing prospect that means you're willing to take on these other risks. And at the nub of our sector is validated targets. And a lot of what this can do is address monogenic disorders. If you could solve, Leber's congenital amaurosis with an antibody, they would do it. It's easier to make. But you can't. You've got these intractable targets that you can't get at. And it's the only modality that you can use to get at them. But guess what? It's a monogenic recessive disorder. It's the most validated target around. And so the whole level of risk that you're taking on is warranted in the context of what this technology can do and the diseases it can get at that can't be got at in any other way. So
it's really the efficacy and the potential of potentially curative, but addressing diseases that are just not
The proof of concepts we see, and Gilbert, I think is a special case because we don't quite know if that one works. But the other proof of concept, the haemophilia B, LCA2, and there's others popping up, they're dramatic. Yep. What the CAR T guys have seen in B-cell leukemias, that's dramatic. And that efficacy, it is a problem in the commercial model. But if we're in a society that can't find a way to pay for that, but can pay for some of the other things that are paid for, something's gone horribly wrong. And so it does feel like it will be solved. And there's going to be bumps, and there's going to be things that we find out on right. But if you deliver dramatic efficacy, I think there's going to be a solution. One of the fears I have is that based on a set of proof of concept data, this sector gets blown wide open and everyone's going for everything. And it's not monogenic disorders, it's I'm going to put this protein into someone on an ongoing basis without really thinking about the implications of it. It's that kind of thing that's going to cause us problems because the proof of concept isn't there for that yet. We might grow to that, but I don't think it's there for that yet. That stuff keeps me awake at night.
Can I just go back to this reimbursement thing? It's a general problem with valuation. I just want to generalize a little bit, but in the capitalist world, we have problems putting a value on something which is long-term and discounted to the present. It's a general problem, and there is a general bias to undervalue these things. Yeah. It's just like that. Yeah. Whether it's really innovative therapies or whatever else, it's always like that.
True. But if we have any bankers in the room...
Well, they get it wrong.
Yeah, no, exactly. But we have any bankers in the room where there's a disconnect between value and cash flow, it's a banking product. So someone, it's true, it's insurance, it's whatever. There's a solution in there somehow to bridge this gap between the payers and the value somewhere.
And give maybe some chance to the bankers later to
I want a royalty.
Retaliate. Just switching slightly a little bit, you talked a lot about efficacy. We've heard today, though, a lot about, adjacent businesses growing up with the therapeutic companies like CMC, so contract manufacturing organizations that will specifically focus on, manufacturing of, let's say, gene therapy products, or perhaps other service businesses that will be in the business of delivering these therapies to the patients. Are those businesses that you would find attractive investing in, or is that, is there a whole adjacent industry that might come up as well, or is that something that you'd be perhaps more cautious?
Trying to start in the middle on that one.
Sure, John.
So in this situation, I look back, and in fact it's an argument to a certain extent that I used with my colleagues in Abingworth over the years when they say to me, but does cell therapy work? Do we know that it works? And I go back to the example of bone marrow transplantation. We've been using it for decades, literally. It works. Cell therapy does work. You have to find the right source of cells, the right manipulation, and the right indications, and be very careful as to how you develop that, but it does work. And I think that in terms of the investment and the type of companies you invest in, the big problem I always had when I used that example was my colleagues would come back and say, but yes, who made money out of bone marrow transplantation? And it certainly wasn't venture investors. And I think that type of business, I think there is definitely a business to be made there. Whether or not it's one that can deliver the type of returns that most venture investors look for is another matter.
No problem. Would you agree, Gilbert? Or?
Yes, this completely. Yeah.
Okay, maybe now time to opening up to the audience. Any questions that you might have?
Excuse me. I'd like to address the issue of miniaturization of technology, which we saw in the penultimate presentation this afternoon, and the risk that I think Chris was referring to, which is that too many people might try to go for too many indications. It might get too busy. The sector might get too busy. Is one of the big risks that we're facing the question of making sure that the industry remains integral, that it doesn't get fragmented with all kinds of hospital-based. I mean, there are two sides to this, obviously. If there's a patient with a burn, it's nice to be able to have something that's very portable and very convenient. But on the other hand, you could run the risk of having all kinds of devices being built and manufactured. Anyway, I'll leave it to you.
So people are going to come up with all different types of formats, especially around the cell therapy and especially around the autologous approaches to cell therapy. I think that's inevitable. I think that there will be people that come up with bad processes, and hopefully the regulatory environment is there to stop the worst of that. In time, there's going to be some formats that are clearly better, and hospitals aren't going to want to tolerate many different formats for many different products. And so, you see it in many other industries where a format wins and everyone needs to put their product on that format. I don't see it happening differently here. I couldn't tell you over what time course that is going to happen there.
Yeah, I would add, I see that in some cases, the type of therapy that we're envisioning here is not going to be something that's going to be rolled out and available in every local hospital. There are going to be centres of excellence where patients with those particular disorders getting that type of therapy will concentrate. And so I think there will be a certain amount of control in that sense.
Well, I don't know whether the hospitals are going to be the driving force there, because I have the feeling that they are putting some oil on this fire, like they want to experiment themselves. They have their hospital exemptions, etc. I mean, it's not that clear cut, and I'm still looking to. I mean, it's not exactly what I'm interested in, but I'm still looking for the next Lonza in this area. I don't think there is anything like that on the horizon.
And again, probably
we need a champion there. We need a champion.
Probably the regulators should obviously curb some of these developments as well that you mentioned, perhaps. We have a question in the back.
So I just want, as possibly the only person willing to admit to having been a banker in the room, I was going to come back on Chris's point about intermediation. Really just to illustrate that there's quite a high level of discussion going on about that kind of thing within the catapult and with NICE. So, of course, intermediation requires data as well for people to understand the risk, and there's not a huge amount of data around at the moment. And as it comes forward, it'll be easier. But one of the things that's being examined is whether payers can take risk of normal death, and therefore, which is well quantified and well understood through the life assurance industry, and those sorts, and whether that actually changes the risk profile for the payer, actually, as opposed to taking the risk of relapse or something like that. So there's a high-level discussion going on which may facilitate that intermediation.
Okay, great. Any more questions from the audience? So maybe...
Well, just one point, just on the manufacturing. When antibodies, well, even going back to the 80s, when enzyme replacement therapy first came out, the manufacturing was solved by the people that had the therapeutics, or they licensed the therapeutic in because they could make it. It was so strategic, it actually sat within the therapeutic companies. And then as it got commoditized, it got moved down, and Lonza's became, et cetera, et cetera. I don't see a huge difference in the model here now. I think those companies that win will be the ones that figure out manufacturing. And then everyone will figure out manufacturing, and then it'll become a separate business in its own right. Our view certainly is it's far too strategic for us to put it to a third-party service provider that everyone can go to and pay more, get your manufacturing slot, et cetera, et cetera. You have no control over method. You have to keep it in-house, and that is a model that's actually pretty well precedented in our sector.
Yeah. Fairly similar to the, as you said, the antibody industry and biotech industry there. Yeah. So just want to pivot quickly to some funding models. I mean, are there some creative funding models that you've seen, in this particular segment? Are there maybe some public-private partnerships? Are there, potential areas where venture capitalists and maybe large pharma jointly join hands and invest in a gene or cell therapy company?
I think all the model, I've not seen a new model. I think all the models are in play, from the, asset-centric model to a partnership to all those things still apply. I think one of the things that is more prominent is the charitable sector, because these are devastating diseases. And devastating diseases, if they do have a silver lining, is that they do corral their patient groups, and they are quite active, and they are able to dedicate resource in a direction. One of the companies we started, Nightstar, we go all the way back to the beginning, started with Fight for Sight, giving a grant to a prenylation expert, Imperial College, who then partnered with a clinician that had a disease of choroideremia, who then did a clinical trial with the Wellcome Trust, and then Nightstar was formed. So Fight for Sight, who I think are in the room, were the very, very beginning, actually with a mother of a patient to start all that process. I think that's quite prominent as a funding model, where you get this kind of escalator effect, more than the other areas we've looked in. But in terms of sort of business model, funding models that are dramatically different to, say, if it was an antibody startup or whatever, I've not really seen that.
No, I would agree. In fact, the only example I had was very much in the same light, was where one company that we were invested in back in 2007, I think we made the first investment, Prosensa, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy company, and they were very dependent on 3 different small charities in that field, keeping them alive and supporting them at the very early seed financing stages until they got to a stage such that they could attract proper blue chip VC investors to provide the kind of capital that the smaller patient organizations could not afford. And that was very successful. And I think it was, if it hadn't been for those organizations, I'm not sure Prosensa would have been where it is just now.
Okay.
I'm not so sure about the model, but I have the conviction that financing it is not going to be as critical as it has been recently, because I think some of these therapies are so spectacular in the outcome that you won't have to run like these mega trials. And we've heard from cell therapy, they're going to file for market. They've been asked to file for market after phase 1 with 11 patients. Of course, it's not the end of the development, etc. But I think there will be strong support for this type of proposition. We also heard from Unicure with the backing they have. I mean, it's quite amazing. And I've got a handful of examples like that, where basically you can tell after phase 1 whether it's going to fly or not. And I think this is gonna be taken up by the industry pretty soon. So I'm not too worried about the financing thing.
It's rather indicating then more competition amongst investors for assets that are very coveted and very successful. All right. Very good. If there are no more questions from the audience, maybe one more.
It was really to pick up on that last point of the very strong clinical signals, the velocity that some therapies are moving through the clinic, and the competition, because there are certain there's some VC funds, there are others that are kind of waiting for the optimum point, and I suspect that it may drive some of the funds into earlier and riskier investments. Otherwise, they're going to miss the boat, because they're going to go straight to the corporates without going through the VC hands. So do you see that as something that you're addressing as a kind of structural risk or structural issue in the different forms of finance?
Yeah, I think that's dead right. Inevitably, when heat comes into a sector, the best stuff gets picked up. Then you rush earlier, and then mistakes get made, and you get cold feet, and you stop. And I think you're seeing that people are going earlier and earlier. I think that the gate on kind of quality therapies is the few individuals that have been researching this for the last 10 years. And access to them, personally, I think access to them is key, and especially those individuals that are clinicians, scientists, that have the understanding of the technology, but also the access and understanding what the patient needs, are rare individuals on this planet and normally have more than one idea. So getting hold of one of them is quite key.
Okay, so if you find a good one, invest in the person, just like the research councils do.
Yeah.
You know, the research councils do that.
Yeah.
Great. So we're looking forward to chapter 2 or so, hopefully in a year, and we'll see more of that. So I'll let you close.
I'll close. I want to thank the panel. I think this was a good way to finish up the day. Hopefully we'll be able to continue these discussions next year. So we do plan to be back here. I don't know if it's in this venue next year, but I know we want to convene this group again. So I really want to thank all of our speakers and panelists who participated today for really what I thought was a very insightful program. And I think we have refreshments, cocktails waiting for us on the other side. So thank you.